about that before we jump in.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, what we do at Avid AI is we help organizations scale intelligently through better systems, automation, and streamlined operations. So leaders like yourself and many others can focus on innovation and not inefficiencies.
Got
Mm-hmm.
it. Uh,
Cool. Well,
okay.
without further
Okay.
ado, let's get right into it. So, welcome to today's episode of the Avid AI Solutions podcast, where we sit down with leaders shaping the future of environmental markets, climate finance, and sustainability. This episode is powered by Avid AI Solutions. At Avid AI, we help organizations scale intelligently through better systems, automation, and streamlined operations. If you're interested, DM us the word growth, and we're happy to book a free consultation for you. And now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Today, we have a very special guest, George Kelly, CEO of Earth Recovery Partners, with over 35 years of experience across environmental markets, ecosystem services, advisory work, and climate driven finance. George, thank you so much for being here. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your story and the work you do?
Sure. Great to be here. And briefly, this has been a long journey in the environmental space for me. And having started with a mother that was heavily focused on the environment back in the 1960s. So
Hmm.
that we're not Johnny come latelys to this, and her work actually led to certain initiatives, including the founding of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation in the U.S., the first Nature Conservancy office in the state of Maryland, and also something that we're quite proud of is her work in support of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, a NILCO that was passed in 1980 and signed by Jimmy Carter, which set aside and created about 103 million acres of
Wow.
public lands in the state of Alaska. That led me to be involved with undergraduate environmental studies, even though my university
Hmm.
didn't have it at that point in time. So we created one of the first environmental studies majors back in the late 70s. Now they have a full building on environmental studies, but
Oh,
so
wow.
it's really interesting to see that. And then also I went to law school and got a master's in environmental law. So I practiced law for 11 years and was a partner in a law firm doing environmental law and learned a lot, loved my experience there, but I had a passion for the markets and harnessing markets to achieve environmental objectives. So in
Wow, okay.
97 started a company called Environmental Bank and Exchange, which was focused on trying to harness environmental markets early on to achieve environmental objectives. And one of the things I was convinced about is that a lot of the work that was being done was viewed as a cost component
Hmm.
to the underlying industries as opposed to being viewed as an asset. And our philosophy was we need to drive it as an asset. We need to invest in nature. I think that was our theme in the way
Yeah.
back in the 90s and still is. And so we became one of the leaders from 97 to 2014, led the enactment of the federal mitigation rule in the United States, which is under the Clean Water Act, and that ultimately was the driver for mitigation, for most mitigation for wetlands and streams in the United States, and that
Wow.
created a sense of certainty. A $3 billion market, private equity knew that they could invest because there was a regulatory construct that had consistency. It was a compliance market, not a voluntary market like we see in carbon
Hmm.
in the US. And so that really jettisoned our positioning. And ultimately, we merged with a group called RES, which is Resource Environmental Solutions, in 2014 out of Houston. We became the largest ecological offset provider in the world because the US was the most progressive market at the time. And
Really? Wow.
we were in 20 states or so and about 1,000 people before KKR, private equity firm, bought us.
Hmm.
And so in 2016, we got acquired. And I stayed on until about 2019, but has stayed on as a strategic advisor to the board thereafter, but until such time as other private equity shop bought KKR's interest. But that in the interim, I've created Earth Recovery Partners with another partner that work with me at Environmental Bank and Exchange, and we are ultimately trying to help the next generation of enterprises and projects in the biodiversity, carbon, and water space. And that
Amazing.
includes those who do technology, but it's also focused on environmental markets, but it's not singularly focused on that. And so we created Earth Recovery Partners in 2022, and we work as either a strategic advisor or a hub for capital. We're not a fund, but we're a hub, or as an incubator for enterprises in this space. So we have enjoyed that and run the gamut in terms of what we do now. You know, our strategic advisory work gets us a lot of work with the companies and supporting their efforts to find an investment thesis that works.
Yeah.
But also we work on bigger things like we're doing blockchain for the environmental market in Virginia, the regulatory markets there, working with a group called Water Ledger Associates to develop a blockchain solution for those markets, where we helped evaluate lands for TIMOs, timber investment management organizations, and ag funds to look at environmental attributes. We did that. We helped evaluate Colorado State Land Board lands in Colorado, about 3 million acres, to also look at what we call environmental asset management review, to basically see how do you leverage and create value for the environmental markets dynamics that are out there. How do you position yourself? What's the economics of those dealings? How do you bring more project developers and capital to the space?
How have you found that, like positioning yourself, especially within such a changing industry, such a change in technology as well? How have you found going about positioning yourself and showing true value?
I think we're kind of unique because we see the value proposition that others aren't seeing, and we're big proponents of that. You know, the value of nature in real estate and other assets. And our big thing is we think it's not being recognized or seen, and so not many people do it and know it and have lived the markets like we have.
Why do we think that is? Why do we think it's not being seen?
Well, I think it's because our traditional economics don't seem to support that, meaning we don't account for the negative externalities of the environment. The markets aren't that robust to give value to everything you see. And an example of that in the US, I mean, if you're going to do a mitigation project, you have to service somebody that's doing an impact in that subwatershed.
Yeah.
So it's a very niche market that gives rise to the value. And right now we think that offset value is good, but it's just a starting point. We need to recognize the inherent value in nature, and we don't. And so there's lots of initiatives like the Capitals Coalition, which is out of the UK and in the world, where they are trying to embed natural capital accounting, and we need to begin that process to recognize it into our economic system. So that's why we don't recognize it, and the markets are niche, and those who played in the markets like ourselves are most apt to help support those who are landowners to recognize the value, and they're very niche.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
You mentioned something really important at the start there. You mentioned about your mother starting this whole initiative. What impact has your mother had on starting Earth Recovery Partners?
Well, she passed, unfortunately, a couple years ago, 2 years ago in November. But she, obviously was the impetus for my involvement in the environment. And I will tell you, she was very hesitant she didn't think I could make a living doing what I'm doing.
Really?
And she felt like, that the environment was just a cost center. And frankly, the role of those involved in the environment were purely advisory consultancy, but it wasn't really truly an economic proposition of a significant matter. And so she was hesitant on this market concept. And so she was a traditionalist, was an advocate. You need that in order to start to create the policy that then embeds the markets that we're involved with, particularly if you're in a regulatory market. And as you know, many of the markets we're dealing with today are voluntary.
Yeah.
And so over the years, we've had this historic dynamic of saying, how does a voluntary and a regulatory market work? Can you rely on a voluntary market? Is it an investable thesis? All those questions that have been around for years and continue to be around. You
Just
can't,
on
there's
that
not
point, obviously,
predictability.
you've been in the industry for decades, right? What major shifts are you seeing right now across environmental services and nature-based markets?
Well, I think we're seeing an enhanced evolution towards slowly recognize the value of nature. I think it still has a long way to go, but the capital, I mentioned the Capitals Coalition and their work, and the idea of embedding nature onto the balance sheet is pretty transformative. The other thing is disclosure requirements for corporates to basically disclose their carbon emissions, whether it's scope 1, 2, or 3,
Yeah.
or whether it is the reliance and dependence on nature. And that disclosure is really interesting because where required, it normally results in action by a corporation who recognizes that if they identify what they're doing, actually sometimes the impacts are viewed in a negative way and they feel like they have to do something about it. So we really think that that's been interesting, although frankly there's been a lot of political pushback on these disclosure rules to water it down.
Why do we think that is?
Well, I think we're in
Politically.
a cycle right now, and I think we have a heavy-handed U.S. government pushing folks to basically promote a race to the bottom as a race to the top.
Mm.
And I think the tariffs, the world trade dynamics,
Yeah.
put you in a bad posture. And I think the fact of the matter is we're in a global trade world, right? And so now, is that the right economics of how we as a society should be looking at this world? Is global trade really the right thing when most products travel 1,600 miles to get to where you're getting to? Should we rethink that? Those are questions. But
How
at
do
any
we
rate,
how do we get those questions to be asked to be answered by the right people? What about the use of social media?
and I think social media is a big part of that policy. But the problem are in now is when one country takes a really aggressive stance towards a negative race to the bottom approach, the others feel like they're at an economic disadvantage.
Yeah.
And so everybody, waters down their dynamics in thinking that it's going to be a negative impact on their gross domestic product. But I think what we need to do, and there are folks, and I'm involved with a board, a group called Economic Restoration Institute, is begin to look at regional economic models and to begin to say, can we rethink global gross domestic product, the GDP, how we measure it? The fact of the matter is, I think what did they say, 60% of all the gross domestic product is based on nature.
Yeah.
If you do nothing with nature, there's projections that the economy would drop in somewhere close to 18%. Because of the negative issues associated with the ability of nature to produce. And we see it all over. And so we need to think hard. And so like the Economic Restoration Institute is actually promoting unique regional overlays to begin this process, to begin thinking without too much structure, right? You can't come in and create a new zoning overlay, but you can rethink models and these nonprofit initiatives opportunities for that. So that's
Absolutely.
one thing I'm doing is joining forces with groups like the Economic Restoration Institute in Colorado to support some of the endeavors that they're doing.
Alongside that, what else would you say is working really well within the business and your team at the moment?
Well, I don't know whether you could say anything works really well, but I think the scenario of where offsets are regulatory, I still think that's a very strong scenario where people can have predictability on their investment
Yeah.
and know whether you can then project how the market's going to look, but that market won't change, right? And so to me, the regulatory markets like the biodiversity net gain in the UK is a great new market, but then we hear that there's initiatives by the current government to tweak that, which every time you tweak a rule in a regulatory policy market, it undermines the predictability. So you got to be careful about that.
For sure.
U.S. same thing. We're getting hit by a new Trump administration definitions of waters of the United States, which undermines the environmental markets for wetlands and stream because it regulates less, which
How does
means
that
there's
make
less.
you feel?
What's that?
How does that make you feel?
You get we're going backwards, and I think the issue is the reality of the world that we live in is that we rely on our natural resources for life, and
Absolutely.
I think there people totally lose sight of their relation to nature and the underlying services they play, and
I don't understand that concept, to be honest. I don't understand how you couldn't have that relationship with nature. I mean, without nature, there's no us, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think, but there's a lot of industrialists, old timers, and frankly, we have folks that are committed to the oil and gas industry, and they're squeezing the last bit of
Yeah.
revenue they can from their current assets. And one of the things we have to recognize in our capitalist world is that when you make these big changes, you get stranded assets. For example, we're going to move from coal to natural gas to electric, solar, wind base. Well, if you're a bondholder that's invested in a coal facility that has a 40-year bond, suddenly you lose your shirt. And if you're an oil and gas company that has invested in an oil and gas field, and everybody moves away from that,
Yeah.
you basically have a stranded asset. So everything in life and policy tends to mean the vested interest. Right now, we have the vested interest controlling our governments, and that tends to be those with the money. And unfortunately, that drives decision making to basically milk the last bit of revenues they can, knowing that the
Yeah.
trajectory of this world is moving in a different direction. And I think that's important for everybody to recognize that where the trajectory isn't going away. You can
For
have a
sure.
regulatory policy blip in the government, but overall, the arc, like we say, the arc of justice, the arc of the environmental direction is moving towards natural resource protection, conservation, and resource efficiencies, and
For
that's
sure.
where we
For
should
sure.
be.
Absolutely. Now, let's flip the script on a lighter tone, George. Have you watched Harry Potter?
Yes,
You have? Okay. Let me
yes.
ask you a
I don't know
question.
about all of them, but I have.
Yeah, yeah, you understand the concept, right? So
Yes.
let's say you had a magic wand and you could eliminate one challenge in your space tomorrow. What would you remove?
And we're focused on this, which is the fact that corporate action. It's not a removal. It's basically making it easier for corporates to not race to the bottom, but race to the top,
Interesting.
and that gives then corporates this level, create that level playing field, enable them to do the good things that we're trying to get them to do. And corporations want to do that, but if their competitors aren't, and their economics suffer, and we saw this with Shell, who really had a movement towards renewables, and their returns went down, and as a result, the shareholders fired some of the leadership associated with that. Yet, when you think about the trajectory and where they were going, it was the right direction. But so I think corporates, frankly, we live in a capitalist world for the most part in the
Yeah,
Western societies, driven by corporates who then fund our governments, who
for sure.
put people in charge. So we have to recognize that and say, let's focus on that kind of activity. So those are the two things we're focused on: is how do we enable corporates to get to those points, and then also how do we disrupt investment, the capital side, to support more catalytic initiatives for some of the folks that we're working with, and the
Interesting.
emerging enterprises in the emerging biodiversity, carbon, and water space. Those are the
And
things that we think are important.
for sure, for sure. And let's say we manage to regulate the corporate side of things. What would it actually mean for you personally on that front?
Well, I'm not advocating regulate everything because sometimes that is prescriptive, etc.
Mm,
But broad-based policy to drive, to give you an example, like this idea of no net loss or biodiversity net gain. or
Yeah.
nature positive. How do we give life to those constructs? And so that to me is, the idea you would say is you want to be okay, how do we embrace those North Star concepts and create life for them? And I think they're good. We want to reverse our reliance and impact on nature,
Sure.
till 2030, and then we want to become nature positive thereafter. Those are really aspirational issues. How do you give life to that?
Absolutely.
And so, without necessarily saying you shall do X. And so that's why I like the disclosure rules that we see. Just tell us your reliance and impact on nature. I like the corporate accounting for nature. The idea of your balance sheet doesn't include your negative externalities and your impacts on nature. And so those to me begin to transform the corporate. And I come back to the question you asked before, which is where do we change this at the corporate level? And that we're heavily focused on.
Yeah, sure. How specifically are we focused on it?
Well, I think we're supporting new enterprises. I mean, I think for the most part, and those are new enterprises, whether they are focused on renewables like geothermal. We've got a company called GeoBrine that we're supporting, or habitat banking, which is the world that I mentioned earlier, which is doing habitat restoration and as part of an offset market. So whether that's in the UK, US, Australia, we're supporting those enterprises who then have more ability to also support the policy they need. And that can be done, in different ways. The other thing is state level initiatives. So you may have a federal law like what I mentioned to you under Waters of the United States and the US, where the Trump administration has limited the jurisdictional reach of those, so it limits the market. But state laws are still in place that may be more restrictive.
For sure.
And so lots of those activities. But we are active in habitat banking, geothermal, circular waste, biochar in the carbon space, reforestation, afforestation in the carbon space. And so our idea is to not only are we being transformative with the enterprises we're working with, but we're also trying to be transformative with the types of capital. So one of the things we have done is joint ventured with a nonprofit called Resolve, and to create a for-profit subsidiary of that nonprofit to basically identify catalytic capital that is more concessionary, meaning the terms are better or longer than the traditional commercial terms, to enable these enterprises to succeed.
Wow, amazing, George. Now, if we look into the future, where do you want Earth Recovery Partners to be 6 to 12 months from now?
We want to be the hub, the continued hub for capital, and we want to do it through two ways. One is we, through this concessionary world, to really be disruptive in the catalytic side of the equation. And frankly, there's a lot of impact capital in this space, but not much of it's impactful. A lot of it's commercial rates and impact clothing. And we say we need to be more catalytic, and there's a lot of initiatives behind that, but we need to be catalytic. We need to get that next generation of enterprise in place. And so we want to be that continued hub for capital. But the second thing is, in working with a nonprofit, we think there's ways, in the U.S. to pool funding to support the portfolio initiatives that we're vetting.
Absolutely.
And not do it as a fund, but there's something called donor advised funds in the U.S. that is an alternative to foundations, but to do it in that fashion, pooling funding to make catalytic capital more available and less
Wow, amazing.
So we hope to have a couple of probably 3 to 5 companies funded in the next 12 months, and that's a significant issue for us. That's a lot of work, but that's our goal.
For sure. Absolutely. Before we wrap the main section, what would you say the biggest lesson you've learned in your journey that got you to where you are today? That could be a personal lesson or a business lesson, however you'd like to answer.
I tell you the journey of, one, you got to follow your passion, and if you love what you do, this is my 5th chapter in this space, and you hear that a lot, and it can be trite, but it is follow something that, and what is passion? Well, maybe it's something you're good at. because you've done over the years may not be your everything in your heart, but you have to follow something that you know that that you don't view it as work. The other thing is nothing's linear in this world, and you need to learn to navigate. Frankly, when we started the environmental market company in the 1990s, we almost shut the door twice. So we went from a scenario of literally having to fight for keep staying alive to basically getting acquired by KKR. So that spectrum is this notion of you can't give up. Perseverance is passion, perseverance, and then I call it navigation. So when you have an administration in the United States that is hostile to the environment and actually undercuts all of the policy that you need to navigate and find the directions. For example, okay, the feds do that, but are there states where they have high-end laws that we can undertake for the work that we're doing?
Yeah.
So
almost like you're fighting a losing battle, right?
It's not we know it's not losing because
of course
the
it's
issue,
not losing, yeah.
Yeah, because the issue is being resource efficient is actually a business case, in and of itself. So you're like that promotion of being resource efficient at the heart of what we do. We know ultimately you get clouded with vested interest and other things, but the reality is if it's cheaper, if solar and wind are cheaper, they're going to win out at some point in time, despite some of the vested interests that are holding on to the stranded assets that they have. So passion, perseverance, and navigation.
Wow. Brilliant, George. George, this has been a brilliant conversation. I really appreciate your insights, genuinely. It's so interesting to know there is still people out there who actually care about the environment, believe it or not. Yeah. Any last message you'd like to leave to our viewers? Where do we find you? Any website, LinkedIn, anything like that?
Yes, I mean, we're, look for Earth Recovery Partners on our website. We're in LinkedIn as well. We're happy to always engage. I think one of the things our message to anybody is that we're here to support the next generation of enterprises and projects in this space. And that next generation could be the next young generation, but it also can be the next generation of enterprise. Could be an older group that's running a new generation enterprise. But we need, to me, the theme is you need that, what somebody said, and I was at a bunch of TED Talks over the weekend, the radical incrementalism. That every step is, incremental step. Don't negate that. Even though your wins may be incremental, they make a difference.
Absolutely. That's some amazing insights by George Kelly there. George, thank you so much for joining us, and we really hope you gain some success over the next 6 to 12 months and further along. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you for having me. Take care.
Thank you very much.